Yeah. I've never told the story the way I'm going to tell it tonight. But yes, I did survive indoctrination and subversion. As a mature adult, I returned back to university to finish out credits, and I would discover that indoctrination is very real. Marxists and liberal supremacists were all over campus, and they would lay eggs in my brain, and I'd have to pretend to absorb their lessons just to graduate. It was a mind-bending experience resisting ideologies that would tell me to cut off my own breasts and to demote myself to a birthing person so that something genderless can replace me. And all of that business operated under the guise of inclusion. You would learn how to help America become a borderless democratic republic by moving to red states to change the political landscape. You could also help America become a borderless democratic republic if you use migrants to change the census to impact the electoral college, because that would help one political party attain political permanence forever. If you ask me the evilest lesson I learned at university while returning back there as a grown adult, it has to be the lessons on using linguistic pattern negations to create inversion, or something I'd like to call hyper realms. You see, most Americans believe in something called a woke mind virus. While the mind virus is where your attention is, your attention should be on the inversion or hyper realm that produces the mind virus. You're focused on the wrong thing. It's possible that millions of students go through the same programming I did, but I defected from this programming and never embraced it. Millions of students do not defect. If there's a message to send to the everyday American who's trying to resist what's on the horizon, it's that the war that we're in isn't really about party lines anymore. It's truly about who's trying to conserve the constitutional republic that we are and who's pursuing a post-American revolution. That's the name of the war you're in case you didn't know. So there is no moderate stance to take. Not if you're trying to resist America becoming a borderless democracy where one uniparty uses immigration as a way to keep political power. If you ask yourself how America got here, I'll tell you, subversion and inversion played a huge role. If returning back to university taught me anything, it taught me that. I studied the subjects who were policing my thoughts and using my ancestors' history to spearhead a future that is worse than the slavery my people actually succumbed to. So this one thing I do know for sure: you will not defeat the stabilizers by force. That will not happen. They are only defeated by the weight of the government they place above themselves. In English, that means that you deliver groups that demand to live in a borderless democratic republic to a borderless democratic republic, as you conserve the rest of America. Returning back to university is what turned me into a separatist and what gave me secessionist platitudes. I had my mind twisted out of place while learning how to deconstruct everything around me. That's what happens when you're graded on how you defend why the word woman should be erased and why you should become a birthing person, or why eugenics programs are healthcare, or how to look at a cat and call it a dog, because you've played with so much linguistic negation that you're just pulling reality apart. What you produce is an environment that feels inside out. You produce an inversion. And when you do that, your mind wants to snap. In many cases, your mind does snap because of the inversion that subversion produces. There is one really important tool to achieve what the stabilizers in America need in order to do their political work. This tool is used heavily in university. It's called subversion. Subversion happens culturally and institutionally. In university, Marxists and liberal supremacists behave like subversion artists. That's the appropriate name I would call these people. These subversion artists or members of faculty were more than happy to assist in educating, indoctrinating, and subverting the classrooms of young adults. This is how they capture the future, to train the future to call their own country a democracy, when America isn't a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. But students don't realize that. They've been subverted. Believe it or not, if you wanted a nation like America to call itself a democracy instead of a constitutional republic, you would subvert Americans themselves. What this will produce is two nations inside of one nation. You'll have a nation that knows that it is a constitutional republic with democratic processes and a nation that believes it is a democracy. The obvious problem this produces is that you'll have a country where inside there are two dueling republics, meaning you have no national unity project anymore. It's gone. A lost national unity project can mean that an American president can stand on a world stage and openly admit that Americans don't know what kind of country they are. And that president won't be wrong. They'll just be evil. To be clear, a country that does not have a national unity project does not have consensus on what kind of republic it is. When you don't agree on what kind of republic you are, you likely disagree on more than policy. You aren't even seeking the same constitution anymore. That's bigger than a disagreement on policy, right? So America's problem is that Americans are no longer disagreeing on policy. They are disagreeing on what kind of government they will accept and what kind of republic they are, which implicates the Constitution. I'm viewed as a radical for admitting this, but it has to be said. Americans who no longer want a First Amendment are not seeking the same Constitution as the rest of us. Americans who view their Second Amendment right as dangerous are not seeking the same Constitution as the rest of us. Why isn't this obvious? That it's our union that we have to address. Why isn't it obvious that Americans who want to live in a borderless democratic republic are not seeking the same republic as the rest of us? This is not a matter of asking to share the same house to remodel its interior. This is a matter of burning the house to the ground to remove the gates protecting the house. Americans are in that big of a pickle thanks to subversion and inversion. Subversion has contributed to why Americans have become so ideologically incompatible that they are no longer asking to share the same country. And they can no longer move towards a coordinated end in the event of a pandemic. The litmus test for how Americans would survive a pandemic has already happened in our lifetimes. You demonstrated that you kneeled to government and accepted a medical procedure you were not allowed to question, or you demanded answers to where the virus came from. There were groups that could do both so the nightmare of what we were all facing would go away. Americans are now so dysfunctional that we are expected to lose control, that we grow government to restore order. We're expected to ask the mob and autocracy for help. University became a breeding ground to help that objective along. You do not learn how to critically think on campus. You are there to learn how to grow government. You are exercised and indoctrinated and subverted into doing so. So what is subversion? I would say subversion is a weapon or a tool. You could use it to weaken something from within indirectly, softly, delicately. If you have an agenda for the Western Hemisphere, for example, subversion is the tool you use because it breeds inversion. That's two weapons in one. If you had a God complex, for example, you use subversion to weaken a country from within by exercising Americans, for example, into calling their own country a democracy when they do not live in one. What happens next is an opportunity to invert. This is where it gets slippery. You can teach Americans to view left as right, up as down, dogs as cats, and you can convince people that they are in the wrong body. You invert for this reason. You invert just so the citizens you're subverting don't see you as evil. They'll see good as evil and evil as good. They'll see their own neighbor as evil. You invert so the policies you put forward that are meant to hurt America are viewed as policies that save America. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing in American politics today. Americans have become hostile to their own flag, for example, their nationalism projected outward, for example. Americans view their own free speech as dangerous. They vote to raise their own taxes. Americans will view closed borders as a national security risk instead of open borders. That happens if you invert someone's reality. Professors laid eggs in my head and I spit them out. I'm here to tell you that millions do not. Millions are subverted and indoctrinated into calling their own country a democracy. And your response to that should not be reminding someone that America is a constitutional republic. That's not the right answer. That's not the right response, if I'm honest. Because that response reveals that you don't understand that millions of Americans have learned to call the country a democracy. Also, it can become a democracy. Millions of Americans have learned to call what they want into fruition, having learned that America is only a constitutional republic if America could keep it that way. America is only a constitutional republic until the last vestiges that interpret law in a way that limits government's power are removed. And at that point, you'll see the country's meta-ideology switch to introduce vestiges that grow government instead of restrain government. Why is it that people with God complexes, globalists, Marxists, liberals, have chosen democracy out of all forms of government? Yeah, sharing a classroom with students who have been subverted and indoctrinated, it truly showed me that democracy casts the greatest illusion, that the voter is in control. The fact is, democracy is where voters' power begins and ends in the voting booth. You can imagine that's why elites and those in power really like democracy. Democracy is a form of government where the people elect representatives, and those representatives form an oligarchy that can rule without restraint, or rule with a constitution that can be amended to restrain the citizen instead of government. So you can probably guess elites like that very much. If American citizens are subverted well enough, they'll see no problem with that form of government. They'll see democracy as a golden goose. Democracy is very flawed. As a matter of fact, you curse your own country when you call your country a democracy. You don't want democracy, baby. You want democratic processes. Those are two very different things. Play the semantics game with me if you want to. I'm telling you, those are two different things. If American citizens are subverted well enough, they'll call for democracy, not understanding the form of government they're calling on. They'll beg for this form of government and they'll protect it. Elites like that very much. The citizens protect the oligarchy and their democracy. And soon enough, you'll see the citizens themselves make the argument that their constitution should be amended in a way that restrains themselves for their safety. Is it starting to make sense yet? The entire point of subverting, if you ask me, it's obvious. It's to get the antelope to demand that lions take control of their welfare. And if you try to stop the antelope, they're going to call you a threat to their democracy. What isn't obvious about democracy is that democracy is not just a form of government either. It's not just a form of government that promises to devolve into majoritarian tyranny. There's so much more. When it comes to democracy, you just won't devolve into majoritarian tyranny. You're going to devolve proportionate to your census size. How big is America again? Ask yourself that. That's how big you're going to fall, Betty. And you're going to think that a meteor is headed towards you. I've got news for you. A meteor isn't headed towards you. You're the meteor. You're the one who's falling. Because that's what democracy guarantees. You devolve proportionate to your census size. And that's not the worst part. Democracy is not just a form of government either. It's a stage in a cycle called anacyclosis. And most Americans don't know what that is. Democracy is a stage in a cycle known as anacyclosis that signals that a country is nearing its death date. Every country has a birth date and a death date. Every country cycles through various forms of government before the cycle resets itself. Once you hit democracy and ochlocracy, you're in trouble. There's no other way to put that. Once you hit democracy and ochlocracy, the cycle begins to signal that these are your last years. So I developed a theory in school that globalists understand the cycle better than the everyday American. And so they find ways to get Americans to call for democracy because Americans are unaware of what democracy truly means for the cycle. I believe global interest groups know how to speed up a country's death date. But maybe I'm crazy. They do it in marvelous fashion. As they throw culture wars, color revolutions, and unvetted immigration at populations, yes, I do believe they speed up the cycle known as anacyclosis. A population that has reached the stage of democracy and ochlocracy in the cycle of anacyclosis will spin in civil unrest and repeat that diversity is their strength instead of preparing for impact. A population will think that a meteor is heading their way, but it won't occur to them that they are the meteor that's falling towards an impact they won't survive. Millions of Americans have echoed something called the Great Reset. I have a theory that this Great Reset refers to the decade that globalists have estimated anacyclosis will bring the end to an American empire in the Western world. I mean, we're watching Europe burn. Global leaders are really comfortable with calling Europeans old Europeans if they have pale skin now. For sure, I feel like this theory is golden. I have a theory that globalists have decided that around 2030 or 2040, they'll be able to implement their whims and desires. So by all accounts, this is why you should never call your country a democracy. It is the equivalent of cursing it. The bad news is that more than 70 million Americans want to live in a democracy or a borderless democratic republic. The good news is that in 2026 and beyond, I don't even think the answer is debating or trying to convince people that they should rethink that. This isn't the age of waking people up to why living in a democracy is a bad idea. The fight ahead is actually a different enterprise entirely. It's because you're in a post-American revolution where the enemy has subverted your country, weaponized your own political system against you, and grabbed you by the senses, that the enterprise ahead is separatism. I think what Americans fail to realize is that as they exist now, for perspective, we have an enemy inside of our union with us. And the enemy has learned how to use the First Amendment to defend why free speech should not exist, has learned how to use the Second Amendment to defend why this right should be lost. If you need perspective on how grave America's circumstances are as a country, think of America as Sonya Blade in a video game. And the character she's fighting against is herself. Which Sonya Blade wins when they both have the same weapons, but only one is the true Sonya Blade? That's a fair question that reveals what Americans have not asked themselves. How do you destabilize the destabilizer who shares a union with you? Unless you remove the weapons from the groups who are weaponizing your rights and privileges against you, they will use those same rights and privileges to end your country. One of the most eye-opening things I discovered while on campus, while being indoctrinated, is that whether you're a part of the resisting agenda afoot or not, whether you're a part of the resisting class or the consenting class, you're all being ushered into the same future. It does not matter if you are resisting or consenting to what's happening to America. You are powering the agenda afoot as you clash. That's what the left and right spectrum of politics don't understand. When these groups come to a head together, they actually energize a boot that is designed to crush them both. When these groups practice separatism, the boot has no battery. I mean, the idea of removing yourself from red versus blue as a spectrum is understandable, but do not ever think that politics is fake. Politics is as fake as the vaccine mandates that made you choose between your job and a vaccine you were not welcome to question. Don't ever get that twisted. Or you tell me, did you hallucinate the vaccine mandates? Are the vaccine mandates in the room with us right now? When the left and right spectrum of politics come to a head together, they energize the boot designed to crush them all. Once I saw evidence of this, I understood conservatism. Conservatism requires a formula of separatism, because you understand the need to de-energize the boot. So those who were indoctrinated me were so full of themselves, they revealed how they act like energy vampires. It sounds kooky to admit, but those in power and those who do political work for elites in power, they know how to use the energy of voters to forward terrible agendas. For example, if you are descended from slavery, then your sincere grievance of that historical travesty will be misdirected towards hating the Constitution and the founding documents. You'll become hostile towards the wrong object, jeopardizing the safety of over 300 million Americans. And you'll place Americans in jeopardy as you believe you're just trying to end racism. Explaining that subversion produces inversion to Americans is very difficult. It's difficult to explain that if subversion produces inversion, therefore resistance has to observe inversion's laws. It's difficult to explain that in a world that has been subverted or inverted, you can't achieve unity by holding hands and singing the theme song to Barney and Friends. It's impossible. You actually achieve unity by division. The world we live in is strange. If you want strength, you have to place your muscles under load when you don't feel strong at all. That's how you get the muscle. You know, an inversion is something of the same. An inversion, if you want unity, you have to separate. You have to divide. You have to separate into the correct republics for the century. I do believe that this answers why conservatives have failed to conserve anything. As a conservative myself, I can admit that we haven't made the adjustment that society has inverted. And we easily forget that the founders of this country were secessionists and separatists. They separated from a monarchy to pursue freedom and liberty. So the formula to conservation seems like knowing when to exercise separatism in the correct century. Returning to university as a mature student showed me as much. And critics have a hard time with this idea because they're in a loop where they recall what happened when there was a secession, when the world was very different. Critics look at historical evidence that tell them that they should not want to exercise separatism. Critics are not considering that in this new century and timeline, Texas versus white must be overturned unless you can defend why remaining in a union with interest groups who have vowed to destabilize your country is how you will save your country. What I had to accept about my own indoctrination is that when psychopaths with God complexes hear Americans say that they are united, global players and Marxists construe that philosophy as an admission of compliance. Isn't that fun? Isn't that rich? Americans don't realize it, but when you pledge indivisibility with groups who see America as a relic of hate that they must destroy, you are saying that you are in unity with them. You are pledging unity to destabilizers. That's what you're doing, and you don't realize it. The same way Americans were indoctrinated and subverted into calling their own country a democracy when we're not a democracy, it seems that the center and the center-right of politics, they were subverted as well. They were taught to repeat how united they are with destabilizers without realizing it. That's what's mind-boggling about psychopaths who indoctrinate us. I mean, words to these people operate like spells. It will not matter that you were just claiming to be united as a way to lower the temperature in the country to diminish ideological violence. That won't matter. Sociopaths and psychopaths will hear you say that you are united with the idea of imploding America from within. So when you pledge indivisibility to agents of chaos, you actually signal that you are in agreement with the chaos. Subverted subjects and subversive agents will always hear the opposite of what you say. They're inverted in their thinking. And wouldn't you know that they use inversion as a weapon? Therefore, any political action you take to resist them has to observe that. There's no way around that. If you were in a war that was underwater, your artillery and weapons would be hydro weapons, right? What makes you think you can be in a war that's inverted and you're just going to punch your way out of it? You don't have to observe inversion's laws at all. You're just Captain America. Resistance must look like delivering the soldiers who are holding the stick of dynamite to their own dynamite in an inversion. And that does bring into question why truthers believe in draining a swamp. We've got to talk about that. If the country has endured subversion and inversion, draining a swamp won't even have the intended outcome. The facts are, revealing a swamp to someone who's been subverted will mean that person will not even see a swamp. They'll see something different. They'll see a garden. They'll see a lovely warm couch. Draining a swamp to reveal what's underneath will only reveal swamp creatures and a broken political system to people who will see a broken system as something nice and desirable. What was the point of draining the swamp? You dug up a corpse to expose the corpse to people who don't see a corpse. They will see a living, breathing thing that promised them a beautiful future where healthcare and rent are free. They will see you as the person who's attacking the thing that will give them a better, equal, inclusive, diverse life in their utopian democracy. You become the problem in their life. The strongest case against being a truther in this timeline is that in a world of inversion, you will reveal danger and your neighbor may see safety. Inversion dictates that discourse can't permeate. An example in reality would be how Charlie Kirk could sit on campus and talk about faith and equality, and his words would be perceived as bullets, would be perceived as dangerous. Do you understand yet how inversion is the weapon it is? University opened my eyes to how the answer, which is unsavory and truly frightening, points to a responsibility a social organism has when it endures much less than what Americans are enduring right now. Understand, when a social organism, or a country or a nation, naturally outgrows itself, and the people therein outgrow one another, you have a right as a social organism to divide for peace. Well, America has endured much more. We endured subversion, our political systems weaponized against us, and we were grabbed by our senses. I believe it should be self-evident that cyclical and perpetual union splitting is how you conserve a nation like America, where those who assault her from the inside are placed outside of the union by the stroke of a pen, by redistricting maps. The answer seems to be reinvigorating our political systems that are lost to time and corruption in a new republic in the century. It does not seem to be extracting foreign interest groups by bringing in ICE. Why wouldn't the answer lie in a pen stroke? America needs a revolutionary redistricting of maps that would place territories who don't believe in borders, who aspire towards a different constitution, who call themselves a different republic entirely, out of the union. They've outgrown the republic with the rest of us. If you want to live in a borderless democracy because you don't believe in borders, you should. I love that for you. What was it like to be subverted? Subversion was the soft part and the delicate part. I reiterate, subversion is when you weaken something from within indirectly, softly, and delicately. Subversion was the easy part. It's what subversion produces that can bend your mind out of place. It's inversion that can make your mind snap. Subversion is the soft part. Inversion is the part that would leave you psychologically damaged, I feel. Why do Marxists and globalists both use subversion when these are two very different interest groups? Let's put it this way. Marxists do the political work for globalists. So they would use the same tool. So think in terms of a fractal. Do you know what a fractal is? It's like when the smaller resembles the larger. It's like when the smaller is identical to the larger. So think of it this way. A global agenda represents an overarching larger agenda, and the Marxist is the smaller entity. So if the globalist uses subversion for its agenda, the Marxist will adopt the same instrument. The larger and the smaller entities use the same instrument, but they use it for a different scale of subjects. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of a person who has a global agenda, you wouldn't accomplish ushering a population of America's size into the same future unless you use something like a psychological operation. That's just what it is. Subversion is the kind of weapon you must use to bring America to a slow boil. So let's use frogs, for example. Frogs in a pot do not realize they are boiling right away. You would use subversion on or against the frogs over decades and generations to convince at least 70 million frogs that they are already in the world you want them to believe they live in. And therefore, they must protect this world from very, very bad people. The frogs don't make it in the end, unfortunately, but we knew that. The frogs do the political work as they are slowly boiled. Those who manipulated the frogs dispose of the frogs after the work is done, because the frogs who did the social justice work can't be trusted in the new world they believe in. This is what's so fascinating about people who destabilize the country. The people who put them up to this mess, they won't even trust them in the future because they're gullible to destabilize the country. What was the least scary thing about surviving indoctrination as a mature woman who returned to university? Marxists and liberal supremacists are human. They don't carry as big as a hammer as globalists. The thing is, you have to view them as a layer of insulation protecting an agenda, and they can be managed if you know their game plan. These are humans just like you who can be defeated by their own ideas, ironically. So if you aren't prepared to deliver these groups to their own ideas because you can't fathom what the USA will look like if we're not a 50-state union anymore, okay, well, guess what? Then you'll have to get used to losing the entire country to destabilizers, because preserving America's aesthetic costs her entire existence and soul. What's the saddest lesson you've learned about subversion? Subverted people who may have really good hearts are misled and deceived. These people are the first layer of defense you'd have to overcome before you can even address corruption or think about addressing corruption. Understand, as a society, what's heartbreaking is if you witnessed evil, your own neighbor might be so inverted that they view the corrupt thing you're trying to defeat as something virtuous that they must protect. So the corruption never gets defeated. The corruption prospers. How many politicians do you see voting against making indecent exposure to children a crime? Too many is the answer. These people protect the wrong subject or object. Community suffers for it. The pandemic might be the most compelling example in reality of what I'm saying. The reason why government got to do what government did, the reason why government could overplay its hand during a pandemic is because enough Americans took the position that what government was doing was in the interest of public safety. Citizens saw governmental overreach as a great thing, a good thing. Time is told that the government did overstep, but nothing could be done in the moment when it mattered. Because subverted Americans saw tyranny as freedom and safety. So if your position today is that anti-American colonies and subverted interest groups are groups who you can unite with and debate with, probably rethink that. Rethink that. These are groups that could put you in a camp for having the wrong medical status. So that's how ideological diversity can actually become lethal to a social organism or country or nation. That's just one example. So the people cannot move towards a coordinated end or stand beneath the same flag in the event that a virus overcomes the globe, when you don't have something like a national unity project, when you're too ideologically incompatible, when you're aspiring towards two different republics, when you're subverted and inverted. The people will not receive answers of where a virus came from, because enough American citizens will perceive those questions as dangerous, and for it, they will vouch for camps for their fellow neighbor or family member. I'm sorry, but we lived through that. We lived through it because enough Americans are subverted. The government can overplay its hand. By extension of that point, it's appropriate to conceive that there is a population of Americans that should never be allowed to interpret the Constitution for America. They can't. The word inalienable will not mean what it is supposed to mean if subverted people are the ones who define this word for society. They're inverted. What's more is that you'll start to see human rights get paid for with constitutional rights. It's scary, but it's the truth. It sounds far-fetched until you make the connection that today elites promise human rights as they simultaneously advocate for the confiscation of guns, which is a constitutional right. This means you pay for human rights with constitutional rights. Today, Americans are not outright told that human rights cost constitutional rights, but the trade is in plain sight if you have not been taught to distrust your own eyes. If you're expecting today's Democrat who wants to live in a borderless democracy to interpret the law or Constitution in the same way as an independent or a Republican who may be aspiring towards a constitutional republic with democratic processes, I'm sorry. That's crazy. You're expecting an orange tree to grow bananas. On campus, I discovered that subverted Americans and students make the best destabilizers and soldiers. Why is that? These are the most impressionable minds who can be taught that since America was stolen, the answer isn't handing America over to her rightful owners. It's handing America over to globalists who have promised to make everything equal. These are the fighters who are taught to dismantle and erase gender, but they'll also obsess over the first female president. If you need foot soldiers, start at university. Okay, because this is where students can defend that they don't believe in borders, because borders are invisible lines, and the students won't realize that the colonizer felt the same way. The students don't believe in gender, but they will measure progress by gender and sexuality. The people at university have big hearts and they want to make a huge difference, but their convictions are easily misdirected because there is a lack in critical thinking, unfortunately. And most students have learned to outsource their opinions to the internet. So in cases where students desire to research if the state is misleading them, then students will appeal to the internet, which is regulated by the same state they're trying to investigate. The state trains students to appeal to the state in the event that students have questions about the state. That is in the same neighborhood as a governmental body investigating itself for corruption. We see that all the time and we're all sick of it. Okay, this is in the same neighborhood as asking the person who stole your car to investigate who did it. Nonsense. Examples of this are observable today. My experience as a Black student who appears to be descended from the transatlantic slave trade is that students who look like me, for example, were constantly reminded of how our ancestors were whipped and hung from trees. The emotion of wanting vengeance for that kind of injustice was harnessed and misdirected towards the country, which is the wrong object. Students who look like me were aggrieved and angry so much that we would call the American political system inherently racist, and then that would be misdirected towards the agenda of growing the same state that was accused of being inherently racist. When students realized the error in that, we would appeal to the same state we accused of being evil, racist, and corrupt to validate if it is corrupt or not. The fascinating thing is the state can prove itself to be corrupt or not, and the end result will still be the same. Students will liberally and progressively grow government. When you have groups who can move with such blind conviction, they won't fathom an evil that is so strategic that even if there was a plan for no one to own anything, elites wouldn't confiscate property by force. They teach Americans how to defend why the government should own everything. Elites won't end free speech with a snap of a finger. They'll teach Americans to hate the free speech of their political opposition so much that the dominoes will fall soon after. Americans will want to silence their political opponents so much that the desire to do so will be stronger than the danger of giving government the right to police speech, which is what we're seeing today. So if I can be honest just right here, I do not believe that Americans view speech as dangerous. I believe that the left side of politics hates the right so much that the left will do whatever it takes to silence political factions like MAGA, which will result in everyone losing their First Amendment. More than 300 million people will lose the First Amendment that we've always had. They will silence those they hate today, even if it costs everyone in the future. This is why I do not believe that remaining in a union with people who view free speech as dangerous is a wise choice. You have one time to lose free speech, I always tell people. You have one time to cut out your tongue to discover how it doesn't grow back. So if antelope on a safari decide to cut out their tongue, remove their own horns, and put lions in control of their welfare, the safari creatures have a right to move away from the antelope. What's the most sinister thing about those who are indoctrinating me? The way they operate as if they know how to get students to cut out their own tongue or cut their own throat to send their political opposition a political message. The result is reflected in politics. Liberals, progressives, Marxists, socialists, and communist students who all agree that government could not care less about them somehow arrive to the conclusion that the same government that doesn't care about them should deliver them welfare programs at scale. That's what's so frustrating. The student classes who decide to grow government have decided to grow government because the government couldn't care less about them. Understand that that's the logic being practiced. Those who have decided to grow government have decided to do so after revealing that they can't trust the government. So what we're all up against is an echelon of people who pride themselves on being educated, but it's this education that tells them that the American pharmaceutical industry, for example, now this is an industry that will only treat and never present a cure. So this tells people that this is the industry that they want to give them free medicine, free healthcare. The same people who believe that government poisons their food are the fiercest defenders of why government should distribute free food in state-run grocery stores. If returning to university showed me anything, it really is that subverted students are educated into identifying the wolf. Students present the most damning case against the wolf, just to turn around and fight for the wolf to go against its own nature. Whoever's under the sound of my voice, hear me clearly. You cannot debate subverted people. They can't be debated down from their ideas. The strongest defense as to why actually hinges upon the fact that they would perceive your words in an inverted way anyway. Up is down, left is right. The floor is the ceiling. Subverted subjects reason invertedly and should not be debated with because they can't be debated with. If you think that subverted people can be reasoned with, then you don't believe that subversion did its job. And I am a living witness. I'm telling you. I'm giving you my testimony. Subversion and indoctrination is very real. I survived it. I'm not sure why Americans don't believe in subversion or inversion. I don't know why Americans don't believe in evil. That an evil can poison your atmosphere to make life feel like inside out world. Like what? Who are you waiting to tell you? What are you waiting for? Is all the evidence not in reality right now? It can't be emphasized enough that you subvert to weaken something from within so that inversion can take root. That's the purpose. If you can subvert a student into believing that they already live in a democracy, then inversion will help you teach that student to defend that the democracy they believe they live in is under attack and they need to defend it. You can teach a student or an entire population that their democracy is under attack. And if it is not protected, government cannot supply food, housing, or free medicine. There is no better weapon than subversion because it creates a battlefield that is inverted. It creates a battlefield where if you step onto it, discourse can't work. And force does not work the way force is intended either. So this was a light bulb moment for me. I understood exactly how destabilizers can be defeated once I accepted how they use their weapons. Their biggest weapon is that they poison the atmosphere in a way that you don't know left from right and up from down. You can't coordinate or strategize in an environment like that, so they win. You'll spin in chaos. You'll resort to this game where all you do is point out the other side's hypocrisy or illiberal behavior while getting nowhere. You will do everything but neutralize the stabilizers because you don't understand the kind of war you're in. You can't win a war if you don't understand the kind of war you're in. How are Marxists, communists, socialists, and other destabilizing interest groups defeated? Okay, so again, the answer is in the weapon these groups use against their ops. If their weapon is inverting your country, then as a response, your defense can't look like force because you're in an inversion. I am never proud to admit it, but destabilizing interest groups are only crushed by the weight of the government they place above themselves. They put the government above themselves because they believe that government will supply their socialism and their communism. Government is the only entity that can crush these groups. So when these groups say, for example, I hate borders, I want borders erased, they're not prepared for you to say, yes, you do hate borders. You should exist outside of the union in your own republic where you won't have them. The rest of us are going to keep our borders. That is how you collapse a battlefield. So where do groups who have tried to go against destabilizers go wrong? These groups don't know how to hijack. They don't know how to hijack a destabilizer's whims or desires. You hijack by understanding what to do when a boulder is headed towards you. Do you resist the boulder? Or do you let the boulder's momentum wreck those who unleashed it? If you're a soldier at war and the battlefield is inverting, you'd spend time concentrating the soldiers who are holding dynamite in their own contained jurisdiction as you move beyond the scope of impact. This is why resisting feels so hard and unachievable to political factions who try to resist what's on the horizon. Your strategies don't work because you're in an ideological war where the enemy shares a union with you, and the enemy was clever enough to poison your reality. That's the truth. Your opposition knows that if you debate, your words will be construed backwards. And the opposition also knows that if you dare punch your way out of strife, your punches are going to land on your own face. As a conservative myself, I've become every conservative's worst nightmare for pointing out how we don't conserve anything because we have no war generals that understand what a war looks like when the enemy has left the world inside out. Where are those who have strategy? Where are they? We need to make the adjustment. Conservation in our era must look like using separatism. State constitutions have to be amended to stop ideologies that are setting precedents for America to implode from within, from spreading. And that's just one obvious way you curtail destabilizers from moving state to state to change the political landscape. You know, students that I studied with were trained to do that. Isn't it obvious right now that that's what's happening? We were trained to clean every clock, to flood white communities and treat white people with unkindness so in the future they won't have a place in their own country since they are the minority in the world. And while doing so, we're supposed to present ourselves as innocent people who are just trying to fight for justice and equality. So, with this as a strategy, even white allies who hate their skin color join the fight because they want to help the marginalized. And other communities do too. Together, the entire enterprise is deceptive, believes they are liberating people who need liberation. Nobody sees how they're misdirected and deceived. They do not see how they have become lethal to the country America is. And I have a lot to lose from being dishonest, disowned by my own community, shunned. But I have a responsibility to be honest. Bad news is for conservatives who still repeat the slogan that they do not cede territory to their enemies. I'm sorry, in 2026 and beyond, change that. You're not your ancestors. Your ancestors lived in a world where they were not subverted as a country. They were not grabbed by the census, so the census would change to impact the electoral college so that one party attains political permanence. You're not your ancestors. They had the privilege of saying they don't cede territory to their enemies. Your enemies share a union with you. So how do you fight an enemy from within? If you don't want to give destabilizers runway, cut off the runway. The person making the claim that the Constitution is a relic of apartheid and oppression is not prepared for you to say, you're right. You shouldn't live under this authoritative document. The Union should be addressed. If the founders of America were alive today, they would agree with me. I'm sure they would. They were secessionists. America would not exist without secessionists. Yet today people are afraid of making the fight about making secession legal. Realizing that turned me into a separatist. No, the answer is not withholding federal funding from states that support nation-ending policies. The answer is releasing these identifiable colonies from the Union. One of the strongest defenses for why that must occur is painful to admit. It is that any America First policy you introduce today will be undone when the next administration takes power. Every legal victory Donald Trump has today will give the next administration a blueprint to enact their desires. which is equivalent of leaving footprints in the snow. This reveals why a woman like Pam Bondi doesn't act as the radical line of defense and punishment that most would want her to. Is she incompetent? What is she? Or does she just understand that what she does to Democrats today will be done to Republicans tomorrow because political retaliation is 3 years away? What we have undeniable proof of is that Americans are ideologically too incompatible for debates to make any meaningful impact because of subversion and inversion. Americans are also pursuing two different constitutions, and that is an admission that rattles people. The truth is, Texas and California are not pursuing the same constitution. One of those two states calls itself a democracy, not a constitutional republic. And the way these states interpret law and the Constitution are fundamentally different. Because Marxist socialists and global citizens are pursuing a constitution that is amended to grow government. These groups are not pursuing the same future as the rest of the country, which is why they need America to fold so that what gets resurrected is in the image of what they believe America should be. Not to bring Lord of the Rings into this, but, the government is the eye of Sauron to people who understand that government is a necessary evil that you don't invite into your life. You don't project the eye of Sauron upon yourself. You keep the eye projected outward instead. The only political factions in America that project the eye upon themselves are the subverted and inverted classes. These are the people who would unfortunately call the American political system corrupt and inherently racist, to ironically expect the same government to administer morality and justice at the scale of 300 million people. I think the answer is delivering them to what they asked for. If there was an unexpected lesson that came from subversion and indoctrination, it would be the lesson on red versus blue as a false binary. If I owe returning back to university as a mature woman anything, it's definitely that. I understood immediately why red versus blue is a false binary. Many Americans agree, but they can't explain why red versus blue is false. I'll try to explain it right now. There are two nations in America competing at the ballot box because of subversion, right? Two republics hang in the balance, a constitutional republic with democratic processes or a borderless democratic republic. If two republics exist, that means there are two sets of Republican, independent, and democratic political vehicles, rendering red versus blue a false binary. Because when you are given a presidential candidate, it can be true that the red candidate is aspiring towards the same democracy as the blue candidate. It would be false that you had a choice. It would be false that one of those candidates was trying to conserve the constitutional republic that we are. Unfortunately, exposing that means Americans hear that politics is fake. No. That's not true. A red versus blue binary being false should tell you that red versus blue is a false binary. It should tell you that there's a true binary somewhere, and you're focused on the false one. Focus on the correct binary. Ask yourself what it is. The most chilling lesson I got from university? The most chilling lesson I got from university has to be a subject I've never talked about. It woke me up as a grown woman. It woke me up. It involved understanding why I was being subverted in the first place. When you're at the end of indoctrination, there's a time when you may not only question what's happening, you start to question, why is this happening to me? You start to ask, why am I under the cloak of all of this mess? When I discovered that subversion's purpose is to breed a hyper realm that could psychologically weaken people around me, leaving them too drained to understand left from right and up from down, I had a newfound understanding about evil. And I also had a newfound understanding about people who are too naive to see what's coming down the pipeline. I mean, today Americans are still calling themselves moderate and centrist. How dare you? How could you be moderate when there's something called hyper realms and inversion? How could you be moderate when there is a class of people who would bury you so deep in democracy it would look like you were never born? Are you depraved or deranged? Or do you want to fight back against that? By far the most chilling form of programming I received when returning back to university as a mature grown woman. I'm a millennial. It was a form of indoctrination that most Americans won't even believe is real. It's called hyper realm building. Those lessons come softly and delicately to students who are too brainwashed to catch what is a repetitive linguistic negation embedded inside of lessons. It's embedded inside of lessons that ultimately show you how to invert, deconstruct, and produce vacuums. Hyperrealms operate in the open, and they are not static, so they spread. They spread by people who repeat repetitive linguistic negations, unaware of what they're spreading, and they spread by people who remain in denial about them at all. If you still believe that you can unite with groups who know how to create hyperrealms, you have likely identified that some people are just, what would you say, mindlessly under a woke mind virus? Okay. You'd be wrong. The mind virus most Americans have branded as a woke mind virus is actually a mental state that has resulted from existing in a domain that is inverted. The domain itself is called the hyperrealm. It's not clear whether the domain is built first for the mind to catch up and present inverted thinking, or if inverted thinking comes first, amounting to why a hyperrealm exists in the first place. How are these realms created? I will not even share that. But I can tell you that it starts with embracing deconstructionism and creating vacuums. I am ashamed to admit that the biggest eggs laid into my brain were those that tried to compel me into becoming a deconstructionist who uses repetitive linguistic negation to breed vacuums. These vacuums are the playgrounds where anyone may launch attacks on creation and reality. This is a hyperrealm. I would say most professors, politicians, and orators know how to place formulas in linguistics to create hyperrealms. I was indoctrinated by Marxist professors, so I was one of their subjects. I stand on business when I tell you there is no such thing as reclaiming or saving the culture once hyperrealms are involved. They don't go away. Hyperrealms are why metropolitan cities and most state capitals feel inside out, upside down, or inverted. If you exercise students into bringing any subject to the front of their mind to remove the subject's legitimacy, to render it a false authority, then reduce it to a construct to create a vacuum, the rest takes care of itself. You can then occupy that vacuum to insert any new authority you wish. This is an idea of how you can develop both a linguistic formula and a weapon. You can give someone this weapon to use against themselves, where they become convinced that they are a crawling creature or that they are in the wrong body. So can I just stop right here and say, do not ever allow your children around people who use these linguistic formulas. Your children cannot always protect themselves from what appears to just be some mild lesson, innocent lesson. The fact is, people who subvert and indoctrinate are skilled at using a linguistic negation on very innocent people, and the result is that ideologies, identities, and sciences form. The rest takes care of itself. On campus, there were adults who could not always protect themselves from this formula. Grown men believed they were women. They also decided to embrace a lifestyle that involved becoming intimate with fecal mucus or with an anal cavity where feces exits the body. I don't believe that any child should be exposed to this kind of linguistic spellcraft. I understand and support people who take their children out of schools now more than ever. Yeah, homeschool is probably what you want to do. At this point, you're negligent if you aren't fighting like hell to homeschool, man. Sending your child to the state should come with the understanding that the state wants your child's mind. I had chronic nosebleeds from these lessons. Pulling apart the natural world to deconstruct can not only show you how delicate life is, it can show you that nature knows how to defend itself. When you become so full of yourself, like these professors have become, that you continue to poke a hole in reality, what comes through can't be redirected back through. That's what weighed on me the most psychologically. When you keep pulling at something to lessen its legitimacy, to produce a vacuum, nature abhors vacuums, man. So you become compelled to fill the vacuum with whatever you wish. It could be a new authority, a new science, it could be anything. But something always comes through. And it sounds crazy to believe, but America poked at something. I can't nail down when. I can't prove anything, but we poked at something. Because society has already begun to deconstruct and invert. So if I know one thing about deconstructionists, baby, it's that they're good at one thing, and that's tearing down the natural order of things. It's reckless and damaging, yet the damage they produce hides behind the political work of making everything equal and beautiful and inclusive. These virtues are shields that a poisoned outlook can hide behind. The outlook tells you to tear down and redo all the mistakes God made. According to these people, God did not make things beautiful or equal enough. Mankind's job is to fix that. What could go wrong? The deconstructionist is truly one to study beneath a microscope, I think. Some do fight to give everyone a beautiful life. The problem is they never produce beauty. The vacuums they produce to make space for everyone invites evil. There it is, I said it. Evil. And instead of addressing evil, it was frightening to watch these deconstructionists make room for the evil, if that makes sense at all. It's like, today I do feel like America is dealing with something spiritually wicked. What's concerning is it's clever enough to masquerade as love, progress, and democracy. What's concerning about that is people who aspire towards those virtues end up protecting the demonic thing that doesn't deserve protection at all. Deconstructionists love to make everything equal and beautiful. But when they're done, they would have opened a literal portal to hell to then fight for demons to have equal rights as the rest of us. It's unhinged. So what deconstructionists do next is get government involved in protecting what they've created or invited in. America is just the country where that can happen. I hope you guys know that. If a dragon says it is entitled to eating a village, then the American political system will protect that right if it's weaponized enough. Yeah, I had chronic nosebleeds and headaches, and I went a little nuts for a little bit. Learning to build hyperrealms can stretch your brain beyond the point of resistance until it snaps. So when critics of using separatism argue unity with me, I don't accept that. I never will. And it's not because I'm mean, it's because I know that this is an admission to unite with people who would build a hyperrealm to poke at reality for the sake of crushing your entire family line beneath the weight of their ideas. If you're still quoting your ancestors' platitudes of unity and indivisibility, you better get with the new program of the century, okay? Get with the program. Your enemy is building inverted domains in the union you share. Pledge indivisibility with that. And don't be surprised what happens next. If we ask ourselves why territories, specifically state capitals, spin in civil unrest, these are domains where the people have adapted to hyperrealms. So test that theory by viewing how this territory views law and order. Do they see law and order as dangerous? Is the criminal or sexual predator protected more so than the victim? Is the American flag burned by American citizens themselves? Does this domain or territory see borders as dangerous? Are cats, dogs, are men, women? You're likely dealing with a hyperrealm or in the slow drip of becoming one, if this is the case. You're not just dealing with a disagreement on policy, pal. You're dealing with something a lot more strange. When I make the claim that the hyperrealm is the disease and the mind virus is the symptom, I'm saying that the hyperrealm is a state of inversion. The mind virus is what people adopt in order to survive in that inverted state. So, you cannot survive in a hyperrealm if you have not adapted to calling the floor the ceiling, or if you have not adopted keeping your car unlocked so the criminal who is stealing from you is accommodated. This is why people decide to flee certain states or capitals. It's not just the policy they're fleeing, it's the atmosphere. So there it is. The average person will call everything a woke mind virus to tell people to wake up. I would share with all due respect. Nice play, wrong catch. Waking up actually hurts the mind. It's why I endured nosebleeds and migraines when even pretending like I was absorbing the lessons thrown at me. If you were to wake up a person who underwent the same indoctrination that I experienced, they'd behave violently like a sleepwalker. Let me explain why. It's because something psychologically wants to snap, and you can see it behind the eyes of students when you go on campus. You can see it behind the eyes of students when you ask them to defend an idea. They behave as if they need to protect themselves, their identity, and their human constitution. The same way that whales snap when they're taken out of their environment and placed in a giant fish tank at SeaWorld. Expect the same response when you try to debate someone out of their hyper realm. This is like taking a whale out of its ocean. Expect a violent response. So if there's advice to give on behalf of surviving hyper realms, it's to understand that these domains are not static. They are intended to spread like a tumbleweed. If you don't want these domains to spread, what you must do is ensure these realms exist in their own republics or territories. Modify and amend your state constitutions in a way that makes that so. You must see hyper realms or hyper inverted domains as those that are meant to spread like a virus. Okay? You weren't wrong for thinking something felt viral. You just didn't know that those who come into contact with the inverted domain will exhibit the behavior that they have a mind virus. One comes before the other. The mind virus in this case is something you must quarantine in place, if that's the correct word for it. I don't know how else to describe it. The best you can do is cut off the jurisdiction it can move through. And that makes America's predicament very much the ideological war that it is. There are other programs I experienced too, but Americans aren't ready for those programs. Americans are still unsettled by letting go of the destabilizers who are destabilizing their country. You know, that's like refusing to let go of an electric fence.